Okay, I've done it. I also apologize to anyone watching live that's trying to come into the actual room so that you can ask questions and interact with us. We've had a few people coming in and hacking and playing some really obscene, strange sounds. So I think it's best that we leave the room to the 14 of us. Yeah, so as I said, we're talking about this thing called DMT. And what's absolutely fascinating is essentially what it is it's a molecule. And naturally, I remember many years ago actually hearing this and thinking, wow, that sounds like a hardcore drug. And that's all I really knew about it, was that it somehow was some form of a drug. Of course, many, many years down the line, and also now having spent a decade facilitating healing and sacred ceremonies using the sacrament or this medicine, which contains this component, I understand that it's so much more. But the first thing that we need to understand before we begin our little adventure is that DMT is not synthetic. And then DMT is found in thousands of plants, and it is found in the human body, and it is found in many animals. We're not sure if it's found in all animals, but most of what we know is with rats. But I just want us to get present that we're actually talking about a component that's within the human body. And where we're going to discover ourselves going in the next half an hour is that this component, as it's now called by many scientists, are calling it the spirit molecule, seems to have absolutely mind-bending abilities to give us spiritual experiences, or even convince the average person that they have spoken to God themselves, which I find fascinating. But before we focus on DMT, I want to just touch on a little bit of a controversial opinion. And I don't feel it's so much an opinion. I think that it is highly documented, and that there are many, even one of the guys I'm following is a rabbi who's a scholar of antiquity and of history. And basically, these guys are speaking about how many, from Hebrew to all the Abrahamic religions, which are Christianity, all the Judeo, the cross. So basically all the Abrahamic religions, which have many sacred texts. And what's fascinating is how many times sacred medicine or plant medicine or ingesting of something natural into the system actually comes up in the Bible, in sacred texts. And this is a fascinating thing. We could not begin to have the conversation about DMT if we didn't first have the conversation about what is an altered state. Now, what's absolutely fascinating is if you spent a lifetime diving into religion and belief, and you would discover an absolutely amazing thing that most of the historians are reporting on, and that is that there is one thing that all forms of religion and shamanism have in common at its core. And what that is an altered state. So before we can decide if that's true, we have to essentially look at what an altered state is. And of course, I am not a neurologist, and this is something you can really investigate for yourself. But what I have been doing for a very long time is putting people into altered states. What we do know, with the amount of incredible imaging that exists in biological and in hospital technologies nowadays, is we know some very interesting things, and that is that we have different kinds of brain waves. And of course, we could get into the whole beta and theta and all these conversations. I have to laugh. There's so many people trying to come into the room, and I refuse to let them in, just in case one of them is that Andrew Tate guy again. Yeah, it's really funny that you can have your Zoom hacked. So what's fascinating about this altered state conversation is at some point over the last, we don't even know, few thousand years, what essentially happened is that we actually started to develop a part of our brain that became very aware of its separation, able to almost contemplate its juxtaposition in the view to the other animals in reality. And the only reason why this is such an interesting conversation is this part of our brain gives us identity. Now, having identity is also one of the reasons that we have essentially, in our perspective, become so isolated. And what's fascinating, before you think I'm going to be giving you a long, boring science lesson, what's fascinating is that there are certain things that slow down that area of your brain. And what essentially dissolves is your individuality or your obsession with your separateness to things. Now, this is where it becomes boom. Now, thousands of years, we didn't essentially know that. What we had was the proof in the pudding. We essentially had certain things that gave people these absolutely spiritual, mind-expanding, heart-opening experiences, and entire cultures, mythologies, and belief systems were built around this. Now, in hindsight, we can look back and we can discover that where we are so convinced that these things have nothing in common, we discover that to alter our states in a way that a certain part of our brain steps aside, where we are no longer obsessed with the individuality or the ego or the me or the I, we are then able to see the reality or the universe from a neutral perspective. Some people would call it a moment of enlightenment. Some people call it speaking to God. And essentially, until it's actually something you've experienced, there is almost no one that can describe this to you. But just be with me. Yeah, this just blows my mind. What kind of things have we discovered slows that part of your brain down? Well, the first one is deep rhythm, drumming, dancing, any sort of repetitive pattern. It's the same reason why some people can fall asleep almost instantly on an airplane. It doesn't work for everyone. But I want you to just picture how drumming was right at the core of the way we grew. And we kept developing drums. We know now that drumming puts you into that altered state where your obsession with the way you see things, or being about you and feeling separate and lonely and scared in this universe that makes you feel that it's so cold and that everything's random. And it gives you this divine, almost, I would go as far as to say, a Niagara of epiphanous beauty, this opportunity to sit and go, oh, I get it. So what else does it? Dancing, we mentioned. A lot of what you could call, for instance, fasting. I can't think of the word right in the second, but essentially the removal of certain things. At a certain point of fasting, we start to spike in not only DMT, but our brainwaves begin to change, and we begin to get to a point where we essentially are walking around in an altered state. Now, I'm not a massive faster, but I've done multiple 5 or 6 day fasts, and I can tell you that it is extraordinary. So what we're discovering is what else? So it's repetition, it's rhythm, it's breath. These are the altered states creators. And it is also the ingestion of certain substances, which, I mean, if you drink a cup of coffee, you're altering your state. So why this is so exciting when you begin to just sit and get present to this is you understand that whether you are a Catholic, such as I was born, and you are doing rosaries over and over and over, if I have prepared myself and I'm in a deep state of faith, and I sit inside my church and I do rosaries for hours on end, I can quite literally push apart that part of my brain where I can experience, whether you believe it is just about your brain, which I don't, which is where the conversation of the pineal gland comes in. But I just want you to understand that whether you were dancing and bouncing up and down for 3 days next to a hut, or whether you were drumming and not eating, or whether, like the Buddhists, they were removing certain things, not eating, not drinking, putting themselves in a pitch dark cave so that they removed all senses. And then eventually, after apparently 14 days with only water near the end, the inner light would begin to explode and they would be sitting in this visionary state. And we'll get to that just now, because we also know that the South Americans accessed it differently. So notice that in the East, you tend to find DMT deprivation ignition, which just means the removal and the very hard work to get to the point where the body naturally stimulates some sort of in a visionary state, in a realizational state, or being able to get to a point where you can observe things without seeing you in the picture, which is magnificent. And of course, as we already know, the South Americans, they did the exact same thing, except for they used the spirit of the jungle to drink this combination of plants that would activate that within them. So we see that there was a very similar thing going on. But I want you to just for a second think about all the different religions and belief systems. When you actually get to how they speak to God or how they connect to God, what do you discover? I don't know if you've ever watched some of the incredible I think it's called Sufism, but in the different Abrahamic religions, have you ever seen them when they dance around in the room and they chant? I don't know if anyone wants to tell me what they say. They say something like there is only one God, and God, I don't know, and they're around in circles like that, and they chant and they breathe a certain way. It's one of the biggest religions in the world. Anyway, the point is, if you start to study altered states, you begin to become so excited because you can sit in any church, whether they are chanting Om Mani Padme, or if they are hey, or if they you start to realize, my goodness, there is the exact same science going down here. The Druids for thousands of years would use their psilocybin. The North Americans for 10,000, and this is only as far as we know, I believe it's hundreds of thousands of years, drinking their cactus mescalines. The South America, their DMT mixtures. The Africans have multiple medicines, and believe it or not, one of the oldest histories of the use of psychedelics is from Egypt, and it's a kind of ayahuasca. It's possibly my favorite to work with. But let's not divulge just yet. So where we are is this realization that all these different religions, imagine that some religions smoked marijuana and literally had such an incredible experience that through a whole lot of factors created their religion. Some religions have built it around prayer. Some religions have built it around dance, but there's something that we have to admit here, and it's something that we kind of just very politely ignore in the study of spiritual antiquities, and that is that most prime religions and belief systems are based on one person's conversation with God. And where that becomes really, really interesting is we are so far gone from when these things were written that we are not able to access how they got into the altered state. That they got into the altered state, we know. And there are many professors, if you want to go onto Google, so that this is not a 5-hour talk, there are many professors that are religious, and some of the top institutions in the world they investigate for, that you can go and read the entire websites where they talk about how many psychedelics were used in these religions that we're talking about. I'll give you a very simple example off the top of my head. One of the Bible verses is Jacob. Now, there's a very, very famous scene in the Bible where Jacob asks his wife's name was Sarah, and he says 2 verses before, he says to Sarah, where are my, what are they called? I'll tell you in a second. It's a psychedelic. It'll pop into my head right now. It's got a very strange name, but it's undoubted what he's asking for. And then what's fascinating is 2 scenes later is the absolute famous scene that was literally one of the cornerstones of the Old Testament, where he goes to a place called Peniel, not pineal, but come on, goes to a place, Peniel, and he ascends the stairs. There's the 33 stairs of the, what are they called? The spine, the Shakti, the rising Kundalini that's spoken about in the East, and the South Americans call it the rising serpent. But the point would simply be that Jacob eats his marigolds, there we go, and then sends to heaven and cannot look God directly in the face. Now, I think I've pictured enough of the story for you. Do you think that's the only story? It's absolutely mind-blowing. So we were told that story, and it's not hidden at all in the Bible. And not that the Bible is a particular text for me. I'm just talking because we tend to have a lot of Christian friends and things. So just for a second, you realize there, okay, so that spiritual experience that literally changed the world was Jacob coming back and explaining what happened when he ingested his marigolds that his wife Sarah gave him. There are hundreds of examples of this right across what we're going to call spiritual texts. So I'm going to leave it there. So we've got this altered state. And what's fascinating is if you look at the East and you look at the West, the snake versus the snake. Now, most people don't know that the DMT culture, the Ayahuasca culture, which we're going to talk about just now, essentially is one of this very intelligent serpent. It's this rising of this power. Very often in the many, many years of sitting with groups, I've always been so amazed how the snake comes and visits absolutely everybody. It's fascinating. Like in a single night, you can have the snake go and have a conversation with everyone. But it's also so beautiful to look into the Vedic traditions and the deep Eastern traditions and see that they're talking about the same thing. And I'm just done a talk on this, so I don't want to go too deeply into this, but let me simplify this just from my perspective, that you have a power that rises up the center and eventually hits your aerial to the divine. And it is spoken about in Dante's Inferno. It is spoken about in nearly every single metaphorical story where they talk about the lower worlds, the higher worlds. The heart is always the thing that guides you. So I'm really flitting very quickly over a very powerful conversation. But where it leaves us is that according to people like, I can't remember his name, but what was his name? Many philosophers pointed out that there's a certain area in the brain that, according to very ancient occult or mystery school teachings, the schools of Alexandria, whereby an extreme amount of people went and did their training that went on to then create the Greek mystery schools. They all spoke about this pineal gland, which is this little area in your brain that essentially, once activated, you can transverse any part of reality. Now, that sounds really far-fetched until you've had this experience. And this can be naturally, and the Buddhists have been showing us done naturally. Why it is that the East took more the perspective or the way of doing it of, I would almost call it like a longer, harder work process, is just a matter of opinion, because the way that the South Americans do it naturally is just as powerful, but the one could argue that the one has more of a longevity, but that would be a very long conversation. So where we at, so that we can move forward, we've managed to create in 15 minutes there, I think, a pretty good base of, wow, okay, so this is not some random thing. This is literally like, I want you to just consider this. This is an inner technology that has existed inside you for as long as man has existed. This inner technology is the ability to activate the inner sight or the satellite dish inside your head, that when active, prayer is not a feeling of pretend. You know, some people get so afraid when they pray because they don't know if anything's there. And the one thing that any spiritual documentary will tell you, or any book will tell you, is the more you work on yourself, the more you cleanse yourself, the more you dive into that, whatever your technique is, prayer, breathwork, religion, it doesn't matter. Eventually that aerial absolutely sends signals right out to the universe. We even paint our masters and our saints that we hold up and revere, how powerfully their energy radiates. So this inner technology is really interesting, because there's a theory that the reason humanity is fallen, whether that's true or not, I don't know, is because of the fact that our pineal glands have essentially been deactivated, or in other words, have shrunk. And because of that, we feel quite lonely. We look around, we look at the walls, we look at the cars, and we think this is all there is to reality. And that has a really, really big effect on how we behave, because for thousands and thousands of years, the Neoplatonists, the Gnostics, the Christians, and I'm talking about the beginning, not nowadays, they all really believe that they all held this in common, even the Egyptian mystery schools, that you were literally building up. When you read a book and you learn to treat people well and you get a skill, that this life was about a culmination to take into the afterlife, and then another one. And literally most of the mystery schools in antiquity believed this. And suddenly we are in this position where we don't believe that anymore. And therefore, whether we cheat someone financially or whether we lie or whether we is not that important anymore, because we do not believe that we are creating our souls like this beautiful diamond vessel that essentially we used to believe that we were polishing and growing and something that would always be with us. So these are really big conversations. And why have we stopped talking about it? What's also very interesting is if you were to go and Google pineal symbology, you would discover that nearly every major religion has the pineal gland on their temples. Even the Pope has a big cone on the top of his staff, and I could jump across religions. So there's a lot for you to investigate, and I hope it excites you and you were to look into it. So altered states are incredible. You essentially can enter an altered state if you're overtired. You can do it through dreams. Essentially, there is a doorway there, and that doorway opens for anybody who is willing to try and remain present when they are not fully conscious. That is the definition for me. If I try and fall asleep at night and I do deep breathing, and while I start falling asleep, I decide to try and keep myself awake, I find doorways. That's essentially where astral traveling, lucid dreaming, all of that lies. If I were to do deep breathing, there's doorways. If I were to do fasting, there's doorways. Dance and prayer, there's doorways. But now we're going to talk about this doorway called DMT. And although this thing exists, all of nature, and inside my body, in my pineal gland, in my cells, in very, very small amounts, it is hypothesized. I'm trying to get used to this piercing, and I still lisp. It's hypothesized that on certain times of your life, and a lot of this is only proven in rats, but there are a lot of scientists on this, that when you, for instance, are 4 o'clock in the morning, your DMT is highest. When you are giving birth, your DMT spikes, that you actually open portals. It's amazing. And I've spoken to a lot of women that have discussed this with me, like seeing stuff while they're giving birth, you know, and the last lady I spoke to, I know very well, she did it completely drug-free, and she was seeing stuff, man. She was having full-on visions. And when you die, which is very interesting, because this conversation of this big white, you know, tunnel and everything. So where this leaves us is this DMT seems to be a completely natural substance that can be activated in your brain or can be taken from the outside. Now, you know what makes dimethyltryptamine so special? First of all, it can never be traced. It's natural. But what makes it so special is that for some reason, just like if you were to take a molecule of caffeine, it would take you a certain place. DMT seems to take you right into the soul. It's quite extraordinary, almost as though, like you would imagine with computer programs, you've got little caches and pieces of code that take you to certain regions of the internet. DMT seems to have an incredible ability to take people right into the spaces of the things that really matter. Or it's very hard to put into language. And what's so beautiful about this is it can be taken in a lot of ways. You have ways where, and even in the South American jungle, there are so many different ways they take it. It can be blown up the nose. It lasts about 30 minutes. I think it's called yope. It can be smoked, which is a very short experience. And like I think it's called yage or ayahuasca, it can be drunk as a substance. Now, I'm going to jump here. We already know that in South America, with this beautiful snake, and if you guys ever seen, go and search ayahuasca art, it's going to blow your mind. But there is a very, very interesting connection between South American ayahuasca and Egypt, and it's quite mind-blowing. So we already know that for a few thousand years, the tribes in the jungles have been mixing ayahuasca. And for you to believe this part of the story, I'm not going to be too technical here, but essentially the reason why you can't chew or eat ayahuasca is because there's acids and things in your stomach that destroy the DMT, or another way of putting it is has not been able to be absorbed to your brain for very long. These are very simplistic stories. So essentially, there are some plants which are called mono-oxidizing inhibitors, or MOIs, and an example of one is a grenadilla plant. All that these do, like your antidepressants in modern world, is they have an effect on how fast the serotonin molecules are removed from your brain. Now, why this is important is you could eat, if you knew what plant to eat in the jungle and you ate it, essentially nothing would happen. And somehow, I mean, there's a couple of chemists like, I think he was essentially a botanist and an anthropologist, but Terence McKenna, the late, actually said that if they gave him 50 scientists with a lab with unlimited resources and the millions of plants in the jungle, it would take them probably 1,000 years to figure out how to combine it. So, and what's fascinating is ask them how they did it. The story varies. Some of them believe that the stars told them, and some of them believe that the plants told them. And you must know how big the Amazon is. So this is just absolutely mind-blowing. And of course, what essentially happens is this inner world opens up where you are able to access all sorts of dimensions and frequencies, even including lower ones like your own fears and your own shadows. But what we've only discovered in the last few years, and I'm talking about in the last 10, 15 years, is it's coming to light what was only proven on a small scale, that the Egyptians also had a secret potion that they used that they called the elixir or the tree of life. And it just happens to be now proven that it was DMT. And of course, theirs was made with different plants. If I've lost you at the moment, South America and Egypt should have nothing to do with each other. And in South America, they figured out that certain plants would create an environment in your stomach that if you took another plant, you would be able to up your spiral, your 33 staircase of your spine, up your sacred scepter, into the brain, into your cosmic zone. You would be able to have this experience for a certain amount of time. Turns out the Egyptians knew the exact same thing. But what becomes interesting is the history of how long the Egyptians have been talking about this is 10, 20,000 years longer than the South Americans. So now this is very controversial, but one could argue that they were the first ones that actually, depends how you want to look at it, but that the type of ayahuasca medicines actually show up in Africa first. Now, of course, they didn't call it ayahuasca. Now, the reason I've given such a detailed explanation is that so you don't get angry with me and say, Nathan said that ayahuasca comes from Africa. It's not what I'm saying. But exactly the same in Egypt. They have these certain plants that they discover. How they discovered, I don't know. If you ingest them, the exact same thing happens and it rises. And their plant happens to be one of the plants with the highest level of DMT, the acacia, which also happens to be the sacred, one of the most sacred plants in Judaism, Christianity, like all the Abrahamic religions. What is that thing called? That thing that everyone's looking for. I can't remember. But anyway, the actual plant of the acacia is, it's even what Moses, I mean, guys, just think about this. What was Moses doing when he spoke to God? He was standing in front of a burning bush. Does anyone for like $500 want to tell me what the burning bush was? It was an acacia. And guess what happens? So, yeah, it's fascinating. The Ark of the Covenant is made of acacia. And I could give you so many symbolisms. And this, I don't want to convince you. I want to excite you. I want you to go out there and go, how does this work? How is it that these South American enlightened individuals are mixing these plants to go into these other realities? And how is it that the Egyptians are doing the same thing with different plants? Where Egypt gets so mind-blowing is that they'd actually have these mystery schools, which if you want to do a little bit of research, you'd excite yourself so much because Socrates, Plato, Pythagoras, all these incredible individuals at one stage make their way to Egypt to go into one of these mystery schools. It's a very famous story that Pythagoras took something like 5 years to get into one of these mystery schools. So there's now a link that they were drinking these medicines in the mystery schools. But the one thing that's very different in Egyptian culture is that you had to prove yourself worthy to take on the secrets of the universe. You essentially had to become an initiate in some way. So I find that quite fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And if I can come a little bit more to modern day now, because I'm sure you hear, I could talk about this for hours. I get so excited. But what I basically explained to you is that now if you go and look at the Egyptian mystery schools, because they created Hermetic, it's called Hermetics, right? It's a type of information. It's amazing. It's where chemistry comes from. It's where medicine, modern medicine comes from, all comes from Hermetics. And in Hermetics, you know, that the sign of health, and they got this snake right in the center. And just for those people in the room that have drunk ayahuasca before, I want to blow your mind. If you think about it, what shows up all the time in ayahuasca, the pyramids and the sacred geometry, constantly when you're inside ayahuasca, it shows you the pyramids over and over and over, and the snake over and over. What's absolutely extraordinary, if you start looking at their art and you look at some of the Egyptian art, you actually start realizing there's a really, really powerful link there. Whether they were actually both aware of the fact of each other, I don't think so. I don't actually know. There's no sign to suggest that. But if you think about the great Joseph Campbell, who at the turn of the century essentially said that what's amazing is that if you study all the different religions of the world, you will first get really scared and you'll be overwhelmed and you'll think, oh, none of it makes sense. I don't know what's true. What made this man almost change the world, he changed my life, and he's influenced me greatly, was like one of the books he wrote was called The Hero of a Thousand Faces. And in this book, he explains, if you think very carefully, every single set of mythologies explains the same thing. And his theory was simply that they're telling the story in a different way. They're all telling the same story. And it's called the hero's journey. And it essentially has many stages to it. I don't want to make this talk long, but if this excites you, go and search the hero's journey. It will actually give you goosebumps. But the other stages, like only a few of them, the calling, think of in the Bible, the calling, you're getting called by God or by something greater or to do something better. And in the Bible, they're very obtuse about it, because usually the second stage of the hero's journey is ignoring. No, you ignore. And this doesn't have to be the Bible. This could be someone in a jungle or in Central Africa that has a story about a famous warrior. Then there's the taking on, like having to take on the enemy or the foe. Then there's the descent into darkness. There's many stages, but I'm giving the major stages. And the descent into the darkness, which is the dark night of the soul. Many people are in one of the most powerful spiritual times of their existence, and they don't know it because they're so desperately depressed and anxious. But if you understand this hero's journey, just like Dante's Inferno, just like all the great poetry, descending into the different hells, and essentially then meeting the foe, which could be, according to shamanism, the piercing of the heart. It could be facing the fear wolf itself, and eventually ascending from the darkness with the mighty jewel in your hand. Think about all the stories you've ever slayed the dragon and comes out the other side with this mighty jewel, who is essentially now an elixir for humanity and for yourself. And the theory is that such is how collectively we actually grow. Thinking we're completely separate, watching our friends become depressed and have breakdowns while we're doing okay, thinking that these are completely separate organisms, never considering that perhaps as a joint consciousness, we take turns to hold the enlightened roles and take turns to go into the depth of our unconscious. And if you can imagine, like the great Hermetic laws, they say just above, as above, so below. You can imagine those that are descending into darkness have got to the point where they become so strong that the trees and the branches and the leaves can ascend right into the light and to the heavens. Beautiful. So where I am in this conversation is that I now work with Egyptian vine. It's not really vine. It's an acacia tree. I work with ayahuasca from South America, and I also work with I call it Afrohuasca, just because if you talk about tree of life, people don't really know what you're talking about. And what's fascinating is a lot of people actually get upset and say it's not true, and I've got to sit and send endless articles, science articles, and I think it's in 10 or 15 years' time, it's going to become very, very well known. Most actual facilitators are very aware of the fact that there is different people. Some people call it, oh, I can't remember, but there are many ways to actually mix plant medicine that defends the stomach and rises the DMT to this transcendental experience. And sacred geometry, just the sacred geometry side, and how sacred geometry has shown up all around the world. I could talk about that for ages. But where we are, I think of, can't remember who actually said it. I think it was Abraham Lincoln said that the doctrines from the quiet past will no longer suffice in the stormy present. And where we are in incredible time now is that with science and with the new revolutions that are taking place, contemporary shamanism is going to become a very, very interesting space, because essentially, such as my community that I work in with some really interesting individuals, we essentially are in a quest to learn to best harness the different earth technologies that are available to us to lead us back to our own inner technology. And that's whether we are using breathing or whether we are using yoga. These all come from different parts of the world. And the days of needing to try and anthropomorphize or to pretend to be a particular culture are unnecessary. If I'm fasting, I certainly don't see that I'm trying to be Eastern. If I'm drinking plant medicine, I can have very strong reverence to where the plant medicine might particularly come from. But even as Africans now, we can use only African plants and have what is by far my favorite plant medicine experience. And what I've seen over the years is just absolutely extraordinary. We are essentially mapping, myself and thousands of people around the world, we are mapping something that does not really exist. It exists in an ancient way that we have certain touches to. But even, for instance, the shaman of South America, we are now dealing with a modern Western mind, which is completely different to what the structure of the human being used to be. And our fears and our complexities are very, very different. And there are many great authors at the moment that have written about essentially the fact that if you look at what LSD, I mean, if you think this is not true, ask someone who studies psychology or has studied it quite deeply. We made more advances with the human mind with LSD in the few years that it was used. I don't know if you know that the LSD at one stage was literally shipped to all the top psychologists. Like you could get a drum of the stuff. It would be sent to all the universities. Hey, I've made such breakthroughs with this stuff. Do some investigation. And as you know, what we know about psychotherapy, about shadow, about subconscious, other than the beautiful Carl Jung and all those guys, most of it took place in the 50s and the 60s. And I don't know the exact timeline. I do know that psychedelic research has only started very strongly in the last 10 years again. And we, between the doctors who know about the mechanisms of the actual brain, many of you know, for instance, that ayahuasca has been researched absolutely up, down, left, and right. And there's very few kinks in this. This is a marvelous, marvelous medicine. But I think that what we need to understand is that as facilitators, because there are even a few in this room, we have to constantly keep ourselves very, very humble. Like an example would be, can mistakes be made? Like, can someone maybe end up being more anxious than they were in the beginning? Or does everyone come out healed? No, not at all. But the hit rate and the amount of, let's just say, miracles that does actually happen, it's almost like if ever I get overwhelmed by those cases that don't come out perfect, I ask myself, well, what would the country of that be? And there's a lot of people holding something quite profound, and we've got to keep communicating with each other. I mean, I know that after 10 years of doing this, hundreds of gatherings and ceremonies, I am learning something every single week. I'm reading a new paper every single week. I am having conversations all the time. And I see it as my responsibility to take all the research and all the experiences. Man, I would love to sit and tell you some of the things I've seen. And to put it to, and there are things like MAPS, which is an organization. And it's really, really important. So no, I don't think it's infallible. And I do think that mistakes get made. You know, sometimes someone doesn't sort themselves out. Sometimes I've seen people become more anxious. But on the whole, the miracles with drug addiction, depression, suicide, it's so incredible that it cannot not be looked at. And there is not a particular person who does this thing anymore. The days of being a particular doctor or a particular shaman have kind of isolated too much. We're in a contemporary movement now. And someone has to be bringing all this information together. And it takes humility, and we've got to keep processing ourselves, and we've got to keep knowing that we've got to be constantly doubting ourselves. But to me, it's just absolutely magnificent. And an example would be that a large portion of people that have bipolar or anxiety disorders are turned away from ayahuasca because the facilitators are quite nervous like also, for instance, schizophrenia, they're quite nervous that the ratio of it not going well is slightly higher, of course. And there is, if you're willing to do the work, there is so much research at the moment. I've been following a group, I think they're called the Helveta House, in America for almost 6 years already, where these guys they've already published hundreds of papers on basically, I don't want to bore you, but basically they take guys that are bipolar and et cetera, and they remove some of the plants. These are psychiatrists. They remove some of the plants and they give it to these individuals, and they gradually introduce the other plants where they rebuild their psyche. And because of the fact that I'm willing to research and I work so hard on this side, I know how to, for instance, that value of how it is possible to do that, how to keep people completely safe. But they're huge conversations. And for now, all I know is that I get to work with people, of course, one-on-one, but I get to go with my team, which is Wake Circle. It's a group which is headed up by Himjay. And I get to meet with this extraordinary group of people every couple of weeks and do this journey with them. And some of them, well, are in this room, and they'll tell you it doesn't work for everyone. But I can tell you now that with all my mistakes, as in my personal mistakes, as in I've got a lot of faults as a person, this work is extraordinary. And we need more people, like Irene mentioned. I think she's left the room, she's busy. We need more people like her that are out there in the world facilitating and willing to take on, because it's a very stressful job, and it's very beautiful. So we've covered a lot of stuff really, really quickly, but I wanted to mention what I thought was our responsibility. And contemporary shamanism is absolutely beautiful, but if you think this is an easy job, you've got another thing coming: the stress, the amount of information, the amount of preparation, the amount of personal doubt and stuff that you go through. And never mind that, just this personal stuff that you have to face as well is huge. But any position, I think, where you decide to help individuals, from counseling to psychology to anything, I think that you are far more efficient at it, is whether if you are willing to look at your own darkness and your own mistakes. So that's kind of, I'm going to leave it there. I'm not going to go any deeper. I want to just give you a view of what I'm actually saying, though, because to me, rather than selling something, I don't want to sell something. I want to excite you about the fact that ayahuasca is not a side conversation. It is almost the conversation. And I wanted you to realize I don't just mean South America. If you get into it, like if you become like me, I could not sleep for weeks when I first discovered this. I have Googled myself that my eyes are red, that we have been altering our states to connect to this seat of the soul, which you've heard that saying as well. It doesn't matter what religion, and they all use different symbolisms, but essentially they're talking about initiations, whether you're in the East or the West, or whether you are a Buddhist, or they just think about this. They are suggesting right across for thousands of years. Remember, Buddha even had the snake over the top of his head. It meant it couldn't hurt him anymore. The symbolism is everywhere, but they're suggesting that you're going through initiations, and that as you go through those initiations, the power is rising like a snake up your spine. As you know, in the Eastern things, they use more the chakras, right, which are just the power points. But just imagine this is true, and imagine we start remembering this, and then each chakra or each point on your spine, the 33, Jesus 33 years, David ruled for 33 years, it is everywhere. And eventually you get to the point where you get to the final activations, and this one, it's just mind-blowing to actually picture that the darkness and the difficulty that you're going through are quite literally your own chosen test to get to your eternal life, whatever that means to you. And I just wanted to show you how it's not just one area of the world. We don't have to glorify everyone in the jungle. If you start getting into Egyptian law, if you start getting into, I mean, guys, as you know, that there's parts of Africa that have very similar plants that are mind-blowing. There's iboga, and do not underestimate psilocybin. And we know that a lot of the Welsh, British culture for thousands of years was built on these things. So I just want to leave that excitement with you, and I want you to just leave that thought in your mind. Like, have you ever had a vision? Have you ever had a slightly altered state? Do you feel comfortable enough to do it? I'm not talking about plant medicine. Go join a breathing group. Oh, go immerse yourself in cold water. Start wherever you want. But what I do believe is that it becomes a point where you realize that there is nothing in there that can hurt you, and that it is essentially the own womb of consciousness that you're immersing yourself into. And if you are already in a practice that is making you feel very powerful, I want to invite you to continue. If you pray in church or mosque or wherever you are, and you feel like you are connecting to something greater than you, please ignore everyone around you, because you know what, you probably are. Because that thing is within you, and you don't need other people to guide you to it. But I know if I go and sit in a sacred building, or if I go sit on the beach, they're completely different experiences, but my inner technology begins to hum and sing. So I've left it early so that I can see if anyone wants to share anything, wants to ask any questions. This has been a really interesting room to run, as I said, because there's only a small group of us in the room, but you cannot believe how many people are requesting to come in. But we both know what we said. They're hacks. They're hacks. So I'm not going to let them in. If anybody wants this, they can message me later. It was a very fast overview. But essentially, if you would ever like to work with me, feel free to contact me. I mean, I do private ceremonies. And essentially, we do group ceremonies. We've got a beautiful one coming up in Cape Town where our entire team, Simone, Mangaliso, myself, and Himjay run. And yeah, it will be at the end of January. And it is essentially 3 days together where we work with these incredible plants. And then it's 18 days of support and being online with each other. And yeah, you guys know how to get hold of me. I think more than trying to enroll for the quest, I would love to just excite you about next time you close your eyes. There is an inner technology in there. I don't usually talk about negative things, but all warnings. But I want you to consider something. Don't you find it interesting that the greatest, according to all these sacred teachings, the greatest gift we were ever given was the inner highway, or the internet, or the technologies within, with our own screen? And look at what reality is doing. We are literally trying to mirror it on the outside. And if you watch these movies that are in the future, about hundreds of years, a guy walking down the road and he's got 3 screens flashing over here and there's adverts everywhere, we're not far off. I believe that the agenda would be to completely disconnect you from your inner technology. And that's why we need to try and hold a very precarious and very conscious relationship with screens and with internet and movies and things. Because if you don't spend enough time sitting on your porch making farts and staring at the the stars, and you might actually forget just how the whole universe is within you.